yeah, because we're not even sure in the industry what games are, right? Something like Dear Esther comes out and people are like, is it a game, is it not a game? We don't even know ourselves, so how can we really teach it?
Ryan's completely correct on that part, for sure.
Yeah.
I think the only thing we can often deal with, or at least I know some of the colleges deal with, SNCC, for example, we deal specifically with the trades that are inside the game industry. When trying to deal with design, of course, that's ethereal and strange and has its own confusing elements to it. But at the very least, for the elements inside, such as programming and art, those two things can funnel directly into game development differently than you get with something like software development. So I think one of the things that the schools that you can more clearly point out, oh, they've done this well and they've done this bad, is usually when it's more direct and it's more trade oriented. So I think some game schools mostly, or at least partially cover those direct elements, such as art and programming.
Sorry, I just wanted to correct myself. I said digital games have been around longer. What actually obviously meant was that all games have been around, and play is actually pre-human, so it's a sort of function that we share with animals and other types of sort of creatures. I thank Ryan for mentioning Dear Esther, because Dan Pinchbeck is actually an academic who made Dear Esther first out of research. And what's fascinating about his practice is that his PhD had been about analysing beat patterns within FPS. So he'd spent a significant amount of time analysing how FPS works and could be used as a narrative machine, and went on to do the first sort of demo of Dear Esther, which was then remade and rebuilt afterwards. But it's a really nice example of what experimentation with form can give you, and it's something that comes out of a university context and out of university-based research. So for me, the promise of getting education right is we provide a space for experimentation and failure, and that's something which is really important when it comes to expanding the form. However, there's a big gap between what we do now and what we'd aspire to do, and I think that there are a number of different types of approaches to game education. In the UK, they have something called skill sets, which authenticated different types of degree programs, and so as a university there you would package up your course, send it off to a central assessment, and then that would then be sort of vetted by industry members, which then had a sort of opportunity to say whether your degree program was any good or not. So the split there had been between three different types of game education: technical, game design and game art. And typically in the UK, before the current government screwed up our education system forever, that was how they sort of split the sort of programs. I can say fucked up, can't I? Yeah. Before the conservatives fucked up our education system.
Here.
Children, please leave the room.
So I think that there's a lot of learning to do. I was speaking a little to Leslie about how in some ways education has to catch up to industry practices, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a significant amount to offer in terms of the time and the space. I think that the article we shared was really interesting because it talked about canonical education, so how we look at particular designers as setting a canon. Now, the thing that's important to me about canons is they're meant to be questioned, they're not meant to be blindly accepted. Anybody who tells you how to do game design does not know what they're talking to. There's multiple ways of doing game design and multiple approaches. All is good, and none should be excluding each other. So I would hope that my game education tries to be as diverse and as inclusive and as open to what I learn from my students as what I can offer them and what I can teach them.
And I'm wondering what you think of applying the skill set model in the UK to the Ontario educational landscape, if it has merit.
It's actually something that I pitched to a bunch of Ontario-wide educators. There was a meeting of educators at, where was it?
It was at Centennial.
At Centennial a couple of months ago, because I think it's both interesting and dangerous. The danger about it is, do we really want education to be set purely by mainstream industry, or do we want to allow spaces where there's freedom to experiment? However, I think that standardisation is something that we really should consider, and I think would be healthy for our practices to have some type of benchmark about what we mean by game design as opposed to game art, as opposed to game programming.
And why would the third pillar be game design and not business? Because that's what I know a lot of schools are looking at.
I think that again, the left the UK about 7 or 8 years ago. I don't know why they didn't explicitly include business into that sort of framing, and I think that's maybe one of the areas that Ontario is actually leading in terms of thinking about how business could fit with and model development processes and development teams, because you're right, it is a really important part of it. So it's something we need to think about.
One of the things to mention as well, if bringing it, you guys can talk sooner. You guys can talk. Just real quick, even with bringing up the idea of having business in terms of actual industry leading how people are being taught, the one tricky caveat that you can run into is, since the market and thus industry changes so fast and so rapidly and flies all over the place, how do educators keep up with that so consistently? Like, how would that work? And is it a good idea? Because sometimes the market will fly in one way and they go, that was stupid, and then fly back the other way again. So it's so there's that caveat. But
I know from my experience in the colleges where we all have program advisory committees, we might have 10 members from industry and 14 different opinions as to what we should be doing. So there's no consistency.
Okay. So yeah, so what she said. Okay, we got two questions. One is what is the nature of game design education, and two is sort of how do we balance the industry with the academic. To answer the first one, well, okay, the perspective, one of the things I was thinking of is that, yeah, it's almost impossible to teach game design. Because assumedly, if we're teaching it well, then everyone who comes up our program should be able to make games, no problem, they should all work.
But that's not the case, is it?
Oh, but I mean, what I think we try to offer is, two things. Like one, in our undergraduates or in our first, second, and third years, we try to teach skills, things that will be useful for people who are going into anything from game design to just even software development or any kind of field. Things like artificial intelligence, computer networks, human-computer interaction, computer graphics.
And just to be clear, those first 3 years are not game, right? You only do one game year. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, the first 3 years are kind of like the foundations. You get all the different skills, all the different tools you might need in order to go into different fields. And then the fourth year, that's when people get a chance to specialize. Then we don't become as much game educators as we become game facilitators. By taking the drive that students have to actually make games, and more like giving them opportunities and sort of shielding them from certain things, and also warning them of some things that are just better given through some sort of mentor than learned firsthand, the hard way. Everyone who's made their own game has had the problems of putting it out there and then realizing after people hate your game, this is some of the things that we should avoid. We try to collect gather that collective wisdom from what we've seen and from what you guys tell us, and try to make sure that people get that early so that by the time they graduate, they're as prepared as they can be with the kind of experiences that we get from doing.
Specifics.
Specifically. So, in terms of getting industry stuff, in the summer times between courses, we try to get, sit down with you guys and say, look, what would you want to have our students learn in our classes? What are some things that they really need to know? And so we change our courses, gradually.
Tell them about the twist.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the first thing, is that in our courses, one of the things that we were told by industry was that it is not a realistic game project unless you change all the requirements halfway through. So we integrate. We basically have a surprise requirement that gets thrown on people right as they submit their alpha to say, okay, you've got a basic working prototype, guess what you're going to have to do now? From Randy, we got the idea of changing our first assignments that teach people the basic tools and replacing them with game jams. To say, look, this is how you prototype, this is how you learn how to do quick things, and so we made that our first assignments. From you, we learned...
I would hesitate that you guys actually know how to jam. Jamming is just
Here it comes. Well, we try. Mostly before what we did was that we used to have assignments where people just submitted something, like they did something on their own, they submitted it, we marked it. Okay. So instead what we do is we say, you know what, replace that. Just get everyone into a room, and just give them a theme and say, you gotta make something by the end of the day. And make that our first assignment instead to get people used to prototyping quickly.
See? Yep. You put it in one whole day, which is one whole unit. You want to break it up into segments of 4 hours or 2 hours.
15 minutes.
It's because it's a process of iteration. Jamming is inherently not valuable in a single unit.
Okay, so the question is defining game education, not the
So-
specifics of game.
Well, okay, that's what
Let's
I'm
stay on
talking about, which is, so the thing is inherently institutions are slower. If you look at how schools adapted to the birth of the film industry or any other medium that is new enough that our modern education systems had to respond to it, game design education will be amazing in maybe 15 years. It will be acceptable. I mean, roughly, yeah, you guys don't have it right yet, and that's fine because it's a large industry. It takes time. They have to file budgets. They have to do one thing at a time.
Ministry approval.
Ministry
Actually,
approval.
we don't have any official approval for our courses. It's all arranged by us based on the fact that it makes sense
Well,
for
yeah,
us.
if you can take ideas from Randy, you must have people. So Randy and I founded Toronto Skill Swap,